What's up, sports history fan? Dana Augusta here of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. Ever wish you can get behind-the-scenes access to the Hockey Hall of Fame and dive into the untold stories that shaped the game? Then you need to check out Hockey Hall of Fame True Stories Part 2 by Eric Zweig. Eric's latest book is packed with wild, unexpected tales from epic rivalries and game-changing moments to quirky incidents like polo injuries and snowblower mishaps. Eric Zweig's impeccable research and passion for the sport of hockey will whisk you through the NHL's early years, the origins of the Three Stars tradition, and how hockey first hit the airwaves. Plus, you get fresh takes on legends like Wayne Gretzky, Bobby Hall, and Joe Sakic. Hockey Hall of Fame True Stories 2 is available now wherever you get your books. Grab your copy and get ready to dive deep into the heart of the game.
Hello, this is Ross Bliley from the podcast Pigskin Tales. This podcast is sponsored by Sterling Soap Company. With products sold throughout 41 locations around the globe, Sterling Soap Company has a unique assortment of products to choose from for your loved one for the holidays. Handmade artisan soaps created by Roderick and Amanda Lovin since 2012, these products are affordable and provide great value. Act now and save on your shipping costs. If you purchase $75 or more, your shipping cost is free in the United States. Shop now online at sterlingsoap.com.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Hello, old sports, and welcome to another episode of the Hello, Old Sports podcast on the Sports History Network. I'm Dan Newman. I am joined, as always, by my brother, Andrew Newman. Andrew, how are you doing tonight?
I am doing well, Dan, all things considered.
All things considered, especially meaning the fact that we are recording this the night of Game 4 of the 2024 World Series, and I think we are both probably of the opinion that the New York Yankees are going to get swept. Even if they win tonight, it's probably not going to be a long series. By the time this posts, you all probably would know the outcome of that series. Probably by the time we wake up tomorrow morning, we'll have known the outcome of that series. But to cope with that a little bit, I've decided I'm going to put my DC fan hat on for the night, and we're going to go back 100 years. We're going to talk about the 1924 Washington Senators, and we are pleased to have with us an author of a recently released book on that team. Gary Sarnoff is the author of Team of Destiny, Walter Johnson, Clark Griffith, Bucky Harris, and the 1924 Washington Senators. He's also written two other books, one about the first Yankees dynasty in the 1920s, and then another called The Wrecking Crew of 33, which is about the third Washington Senators pennant, the third of three. This tonight is about the first of three and their only world championship. So, Gary, thanks for joining us to talk a little bit about the 24 Senators.
Thank you very much, Dan. Andrew, I appreciate you having me on your podcast.
No, glad to do it. So I've read the book, and I attended your one of your presentations a couple months ago at the Babe Ruth Museum about the book. But why don't you just kind of tell us a little bit what made you want to write a book about the 1924 Washington Senators?
Well, I think the Cinderella story of the 1924 Washington Senators, I think that is one of the greatest stories in baseball history, maybe the greatest, because it was an underdog, the Senators, heading into their season. Nothing was expected for the team. They weren't expected to contend. They weren't even expected to be very good. And here they were, the underdog, challenging Babe Ruth and the New York Yankees, the team that had won 3 consecutive American League pennants, were expected to win it again in 1924. They're coming off a World Series championship. And here were the Senators, not supposed to be very good, challenging the Yankees. And eventually they won out. They finished ahead. They won the pennant. They finished ahead of the Yankees. So that was one reason. Another reason was because Bucky Harris. Bucky Harris was only 27 years old. He only had 4 full seasons of Major League playing experience. And here he was before the season, hired to manage the Washington Senators, hired to manage a Major League ball club at the age of 27 and only 4 years of Major League playing experience. And people laughed at that. They called it Griffith's folly. Clark Griffith, the owner of the team, he had hired Harris. People laughed. They called it Griffith's folly. But, as they say, he who laughs, has the last laugh, laughs all the way to the bank. And, Harris, he surprised everybody by proving they have the maturity to manage most players that were older than he was and manage a championship team. But I think most of all, what really makes this story great is Walter Johnson. Here he was, 36 years old, pitched his heart out his entire career with the Washington Senators, and never pitched for a pennant-winning team. Here he was, a sore-arm pitcher for the last 2 years. Before the start of the season, he said this would be his last season. And here he was, Walter Johnson, expected to retire from Major League Baseball as the greatest pitcher, greatest player to never appear in a World Series game. And lo and behold, for Walter Johnson, who had a great comeback season, the Senators went all the way.
I think we should just to set the stage for the Senators real quick. I mean, they had been obviously since really the founding of the American League. They'd been in the American League. They'd been, at best also rans. I think they were predominantly what they called back then a second division team, meaning they were 5th through 8th, somewhere in there. Throughout the early part of the 20s, as the Yankees were starting to win their first few pennants with Babe Ruth, they were 6th place in 1920, 4th place in 21, 6th place again in 22, and then in 23 they were 4th place, but over 20 to 25 games back of the Yankees. So there was no real reason to believe that anybody but the Yankees would win the pennant in 1924, and if they were to be seriously challenged, that the Senators would be the team that did that.
That's right, because the Senators, in 1923, they did finish 4th. However, they did have a losing record in addition to finishing far behind the Yankees. So people thought most writers thought that the Yankees would repeat, win their 4th consecutive American League pennant. As far as challengers, some people thought maybe Ty Cobb and the Tigers could do it. Some people thought Tris Speaker, the player manager of the Indians, they had a chance. So those are the two teams expected to contend with the Yankees that season. Now, certainly not the Senators.
Just one last thing on Harris. It's the era where it's not unheard of or even that unusual to have a player manager. What is the sort of unheard of aspect here is to have a player manager who's in his mid-20s. And like you said, most of the players on the team are older than him in an era when the younger players were not exactly shown a lot of deference and respect.
Yeah, and like you said, player managers, there were plenty of them in that era, but these were player managers who were 30 years or older, seasoned veterans. Here was Harris, only 27 years old, with 4 full seasons of Major League playing experience under his belt, and here he was hired to manage. I mean, that was unheard of. That was a shock.
Talk a little bit more about the Senators owner, because you talk about player managers. One of the other things that was you obviously don't see any of this anymore today, but the owner of the Senators is a guy by the name of Clark Griffith, and he was maybe one of the last of what I call the player owners, which is a guy who really got into baseball at the outset as a player and then eventually became an owner. And there's some great names throughout the 19th century, Al Spalding, Charles Comiskey, those type of guys. But Griffith was maybe the last guy who went from being a player all the way up to owning a team.
Yeah, and he was actually co-owner. But here's how it happened was, yes, he was a pitcher. He was an outstanding pitcher, pitched for the Chicago Cubs in the 1890s. Yeah, so he's an outstanding pitcher. And then the founding of the American League in 1901, he was very influential. He was one of the National Leaguers who not only went on board with the new American League, but he was very influential in recruiting players. So he became manager when the American League was founded. He was hired to manage the Chicago White Sox, and he was a player manager. He won 24 games in 1901, and the White Sox won the first American League pennant that season. So he was the manager for the White Sox for a few more years. Then they wanted a team. The American League wanted a team in New York, and they wanted that team to succeed. So Griffith was transferred over to New York to manage, well, then they were the Highlanders, and eventually they evolved to the Yankees. So Griffith was transferred over to New York because they wanted that team to be a success. So he was in New York for a few years. Then he went back to the National League with Cincinnati, and he managed them. Then in 1912, the Washington Senators, they were owned by 7 businessmen who were known as the board. They were the board that owned the Senators. So they owned the Senators, and they hired Griffith to manage the team. And to get Griffith to come on board in Washington, they gave him an incentive to buy 10% of the team. So he bought into the team and managed the Senators, and he was very successful at the beginning, mostly because he had Walter Johnson in his prime. So the Senators were losers. I mean, they were horrible before Griffith arrived, but he had Walter Johnson in his prime, and his results were immediate. In 1912, his first year as manager, they won 90 games. 91 games, actually. They won 90 the following year in 1913. So they were contenders for the next few years under Griffith and Walter Johnson in his prime. Then they began to tail off, and by 1919, with Griffith still the manager, they finished 7th. Well, after the 1919 season, Griffith, he believed in Washington as a baseball town, but he thought that the only way Washington would ever win a pennant is if he was in complete control. So what he did, he teamed up with a businessman from Philadelphia named William Richardson, and they executed a buyout of the board of directors. So that's why Griffith owned essentially half the team, and Richardson owned half the team. And Griffith, Richardson was a businessman who had his own business interests in Philadelphia, so he was content with blending in the background and letting Griffith run the team, which Griffith wanted. Griffith gladly wanted that position. So Griffith called the shots, and Griffith decided who would manage the team. And he went through a manager a year. 1920, he managed the team himself. That was his last year. Then in 1921, he hired a manager. Then he hired a different manager in 1922. 1923, he had a different manager. And then in 1924, he hired Bucky Harris.
Yeah, it's an example of basically trying everything and eventually something works. But there was no reason really to believe, with the backdrop of he was the manager and then a different manager every year. And now they're trying this young player manager, in this day and age, like in the modern era, it would probably be seen as sort of a desperation move because nobody else wanted the job. Although obviously the results would be much different.
Yeah, and that's kind of the way it worked out for Washington, because after the 1923 season, Griffith fired the manager, Donnie Bush. That was the third manager. That was 3 managers in 3 years, or 4 managers in 4 years if you count Griffith in 1920. So he went through a manager a year for 4 years, and he wanted, after the 1923 season, he wanted Eddie Collins from the White Sox, Hall of Fame second baseman, who was 36 years old. Still had some good years left in him. So he wanted Collins in the worst way to manage the team. So he tried to swing a deal for Collins with the White Sox. However, he didn't want to trade anything. He really didn't want to give anything. And the White Sox, they're like, if you want Collins, you're going to have to give up some good players, So they couldn't swing a deal. Then he looked at some other possibilities. He tried Ed Barrow, who managed the Red Sox. During the Babe Ruth era, the Red Sox had a lot of success at managing the Red Sox. By 1924, he was business manager of the Yankees. And Griffith, asked him, hey, you want to get back into managing? You can manage the Senators. But Barrow said, no, thank you. So it was by this time, it was February. It was a week before spring training, and Griffith still didn't have a manager in place, so he turned to Bucky Harris.
Let's talk a little bit more. We obviously the big figures here are Johnson and Harris, but there are other stars on the team, including a couple other Hall of Famers. Give us the names and some background on some of the other big time guys on the 24 team.
Yeah, they did have a couple of other Hall of Famers. Walter Johnson's in the Hall of Fame, like we said, and so is Bucky Harris. Got into the Hall of Fame as manager since he had a successful managerial career. But the other Hall of Famers on that team, Goose Goslin, the starting left fielder, who was only 23 years old that season. So Goslin was, an outstanding hitter, outstanding ball player. He's a Hall of Famer that was on that team. And The starting right fielder, Sam Rice, was also a Hall of Famer. By that time, he was 34 years old. He was a veteran who had a very successful career, but he still had a lot of good years left in him. In fact, he was still good into his 40s. But yes, Sam Rice was a Hall of Famer as well. So they had 4 Hall of Famers, and if you want to count Clark Griffith, that makes 5 Hall of Famers. But they also had some other very good players, although not Hall of Famers. Roger Peckinpah was an excellent fielding shortstop and a veteran and a good leader. Starting shortstop for that team and he teamed up with Harris to comprise a very successful double play combination. Joe Judge, the first baseman, many believe he should be in the Hall of Fame, had a lifetime batting average over 300. Excellent fielding first baseman as well. Ossie Bluege, third baseman, outstanding fielder, was the starting third baseman for that team. And Muddy Rule was an excellent defensive catcher, was the starting catcher for that team. So that was a very good team, that just happened to gel. It all came together that year, but they certainly had the horses. They certainly had the players in place to do that.
Just as sort of an aside, Goose Goslin, I think I've always been really fascinated by his career, because Goose Goslin is a guy between 1924 and 1935 plays on 5 American League pennant winners. And in the 20s and 30s, it was damn near impossible to play on 5 American League pennant winners without being on the Yankees at some point. But Goslin's with the Senators for the whole 20s. He actually leaves for a couple of years, goes to St. Louis, comes back to Washington for 1 year in 1933, is on a pennant winner in 33 with the Senators, and then immediately goes to Detroit, where he wins 2 more pennants and a world championship with the Detroit Tigers, with those great, Greenberg, Gehringer, Cochran teams. So you talk about a guy who really was probably on he wasn't on the Athletics either, I guess, but 2 of the other great American League powerhouses of the 20s and 30s.
Yeah, that is quite a story. Goose Goslin, one thing about Goslin is he's a hard guy to manage, a hard guy to coach. Mm-hmm. He was a loose cannon. He kind of marched to the beat of his own drum, but he was a great hitter, and he certainly knew how to win, to play on 5 pennant winners and not be on the Yankees. He certainly knew how to win, that's for sure.
So let's talk a little bit about the season, because they win the pennant eventually, but they don't start well.
Yeah, it took time for Bucky Harris's fiery spirit. It took time for the team to rally around him. So yeah, they got off to a bad start. By mid-May, they were in 7th place, and it looked like it was going to be a long season, another losing season for Washington. Then comes mid-June, and the team suddenly started getting hot, and then they had a winning streak going. Then they go to New York to play the Yankees in a 4-game series at Yankee Stadium. The other team they're fighting for the pennant, and here are the New York Yankees, 3-time American League pennant winners, world champions, and the Senators go in there and they sweep all 4 games. So suddenly they have a winning streak going. They swept the Yankees. They come home, and Washington was waiting for them. By this time, Washington woke up to the fact that, hey, we've got a really good team here. We got something special going here. So Washington started rallying around them, and they played great baseball in June and into early July. I believe they won 19 out of 20 or 21 games. I mean, they were a red-hot team. Then they slumped a little bit in July, and they fell out of first place. And then in August, they went to St. Louis, where it was so hot. This is early August. St. Louis was always notorious back then for its heat. They go into St. Louis, and it's the hottest heat wave of the year, and they get swept in 5 games by the Browns. They fall into 3rd place. So now it looks like it's all over with, but then they get hot again, and then they go into New York to finish the month of August, the weekend series, 4 games. They were in 2nd place when that series began. They took 3 out of 4 from the Yankees to move into 1st place by half a game. So now they're in 1st place. The season's heading into September. The question is, could they hang on? They're a young team. They're inexperienced. They're barely ahead of the Yankees. The Yankees have Babe Ruth. They have the experience. Could they do it? But lo and behold, they kept winning, and they held on, and they managed to edge out the Yankees by 2 games for the American League pennant.
You mentioned that stretch in June. In a week's time, they went from 6th place to 1st place in June. Now they were only 4.5 back, even when they were in 6th place, but they went on that run, were winning every day, a couple of double headers thrown in there, and they jumped 5 spots. On the Yankees, just to mention them, you think, okay, it's a Yankee team that didn't win. A lot of times in the 20s, that meant it was one of the times that Babe Ruth was either suspended or having problems or the team wasn't healthy. This is actually still a Yankee team. Ruth plays in 153 games. So, all but one game, or maybe even every game, if you don't count the tie, he hits 46 home runs with 124 RBIs. It's still pretty much the team they had the year before in 23. So it's not like this Senator team, caught the Yankees when the Yankees were having an off year or whatever. They just outpaced the Yankees, who were at their strongest.
Yeah, they did. They matched up well against, they beat the Yankees when they played them head on head. And the Yankees, they were so dominant in 1923. They finished, way ahead of the second place team in 1923 and, beat the Giants in 6 in the World Series. So, the Yankees, they were defending world champions, and they had Babe Ruth and Wally Pipp and Bob Musial. They had a lot of talent, a hard-hitting team, but there are different reasons. People talk about why the Yankees didn't win it in 24. There's a lot of different reasons that people think, a lot of different theories back then and even today. Why didn't the Yankees do it in 1924? But the Senators were, hot that year. It was their year. They were destined, and things just worked out. Everything fell into place for Washington.
It reminds me a little bit of 30. Sorry, Dan. It reminds me a little bit of 30 years later in 1954, when the Yankees had won 5 straight championships and they were still really good in 54. Yeah. It was just Cleveland's year.
Right.
And just to put a point on your point, Andrew, this is a great year for Babe Ruth. In fact, he's only one spot away from a triple crown. He's got 46 home runs, which is the most in baseball. He's got a 378 average, which leads the American League. And then his 124 RBIs is second in the league behind only the aforementioned Goose Goslin. So, this isn't like the following year in 25 or some of these other years where Ruth really just hit the skids. Like you said, Gary, the Senators they were better, especially down the stretch.
Yeah, they sure were, because their pitchers did very well. They had Walter Johnson, had a sensational season. He was MVP. And, these other pitchers, George Mogridge and Tom Zachary, and a rookie named Firpo Marbury, were outstanding. But just on a note about Babe Ruth, we talk about, 1925, this decline in 1925. And through my research, as I did my research about this season, I found that it actually happened. It began at the tail end of the 1924 season, because in early August, Babe Ruth was on his way to the Triple Crown. He was hitting 408 in early August. Yeah, he was having a great year. He was having his best season. And then all of a sudden, it kind of went unnoticed, but he wasn't hitting like he didn't keep up that 400 batting average pace. He ended up at 378. Still a great year, but his numbers declined, through the rest of August and into September, and that was partly due to a shoulder injury. He had a shoulder injury and kept playing, but also because the decline in 1925, he had gained a lot of weight. It was showing actually in 1924 that he was gaining weight. So that started in 1924, and if Babe Ruth had maintained that 408 batting average, those batting numbers he's putting up, the Yankees may very well have won the pennant that year.
You mentioned the pitching, and we touched on a couple of the guys, and Walter Johnson coming into this year. He's 36. He goes 23-7 with a 2.72 ERA. And, I was looking through his yearly numbers, and without really processing it, you look at it and you go, wow, he really started to fall off, or his numbers really jumped up in 1920. He must have been getting old. And then you realize you have to adjust that year for the new era, the start of the live ball. He's still at 36 years old, maybe not the dominant pitcher he was, maybe not the sort of in a class of his own pitcher he was 10 to 15 years prior, but he's still a dominant pitcher, 23 wins, 38 starts, and a sub-3 ERA in the early days of the live ball era.
Here's what happened with Walter Johnson. Was in 1920, they were in spring training, and he caught a heavy cold. So he had this heavy cold. He was idle because of that for a few weeks, and the cold eventually left his body. But when the cold finally evaporated, he said that it left a knot in his pitching arm. There was a knot in his pitching arm, and he said it was very bothersome. And what it did, it limited his fastball, because Walter Johnson, as hard as he threw, he had that blazing fastball. But also what really made him hard to hit, what really made life tough for opposing batters, was he didn't only have the fastball, but that fastball would hop. That fastball had a hop on it, so it was hard. As fast as that pitch was, when it hopped like that, it was just impossible to hit. Well, because of that sore arm, he could still throw as hard as he could, but that hop on his fastball was missing. So he had that knot in his arm through 1920 and 1921, all the way through the 1923 season. But however, each passing year, that knot was reduced. It kept going down and down and getting smaller and smaller. And then after the 1923 season, he worked to strengthen his legs, because he had problems with his legs during that season. So he did a lot of hiking, hunting, walking, and he wanted to strengthen his legs. Well, as he strengthened his legs, he also managed to take care of that knot. That knot had vanished before the 1924 season. So now here it was, 1924, that hop in his fastball was back. It was back. So he's throwing hard, and that hop is back in his fastball. And that's why he had such an outstanding year in 1924 especially in comparison to the few years before that.
And you're right. That really is a significant. That injury in 1920 really shows, because you look at his ERA, and I'll just start, 1.36, 1.90, 1.39, 1.14, 1.72, 1.55, 1.90, up to 2.21, but then back down to 1.27 and 1.49. And then in 1920, all the way up to 3.13. So his ERA really jumps from almost, less than 1.5 to over 3 from 1919 to 1920. How serious was he about quitting after the 24 season? Going into the 24 season, how serious is he that this is going to be his last year?
He was definite. I mean, it was for sure. He wrote a letter to Griffith in January, and his reasoning for retiring, it wasn't because of age, because he still actually wanted to pitch in the minors. What the situation was this: he had a family. He and his wife, they had a family. They had children, and they would live in Washington during the baseball season. Then they go to his hometown in Coffeyville, Kansas, after the season. Then they go to his wife's hometown, Reno, Nevada, then back to Washington. So they thought it was an injustice to their children to have them move around like that all the time. They thought that wasn't right because, they couldn't adjust. It was just too hard for them to go from town to town and school to school. So what they wanted to do, they just wanted to settle down in one place where their children could go to one school, stay there all year, live all year around. So that was his plan. And what he wanted to do was, and he had financial backing to do this because ball players didn't make the salaries like they did today. He had financial backing to buy a Pacific Coast League baseball team. He wasn't sure which one. He wanted to buy a team in the Pacific Coast League. He wanted to move his family to California. He wanted to be a part owner, a manager, and part-time pitcher for a Pacific Coast League team, live on the West Coast, and that was it. So that was his plan. So after the 1924 season, he had the great season. He won Game 7 of the 1924 World Series. So now after that, his plan, he went out west to California to investigate the possibility of buying a Pacific Coast League team. Well, these owners in the Pacific Coast League, we'll sell you the team, but here's the price. They tried to highball because they knew he wanted a team, so they added more to the price. That what they wanted to sell the team for was more than what the value of the team was. So he couldn't find a team at a reasonable price, so he came back to Washington in 1925, and he actually pitched 3 more seasons through 1927 before retiring.
I want to get to the sort of the end of the season, the pennant and the World Series, but just another question here. They've been losing for so long. What's the reception like what are the fans? Is the city excited for the team? Were they sort of apathetic before the season started? What's the fan interest in the team, both at the beginning of the year and then as time goes on?
Yeah, well, during the winter in February, they didn't have a manager in place. They didn't have a manager in place, and they were coming off a losing, even though they finished fourth, they had a losing record in 1923, and they made no roster moves. So they don't have a manager. They're coming off a losing season, no roster moves. They have basically the same team heading into the 24 season. So one of the sports writers from the Washington Herald, I believe, he went out to the streets. He talked to Washington baseball fans, and his report was, enthusiasm has never been so low about Washington baseball. Nobody's into it because of the situation, and they don't have a manager and, a losing season and no roster moves. So nobody's into the baseball season. No one's looking forward to the Senators in 1924. So then they hired Harris, and that was exciting. They sold out on opening day, but they got off to the bad start. Not only that, there were a lot of rainouts, and not only that Washington was flooded. In mid-May, there was a big flood, one of the worst floods in the history of Washington. So nobody, and the team's in seventh place, so nobody was in the baseball, the first few months of the season. Then they go on the winning streak. In June, now the fans are totally into it. Everybody's into it. They swept the Yankees at Yankee Stadium. They're on a winning streak here. After they swept the Yankees, when they arrived back in Washington by train at Union Station, they were greeted by a huge crowd. Okay, there was a huge crowd out there on hand to greet the victorious Senators when they came back to town. The next day, they played the Philadelphia Athletics in a doubleheader. It sold out. Now everybody's into it. Even the President Coolidge, he's there. He attended the game when they came back, from New York, the June doubleheader against the Athletics. He's there. Everybody's into it now. The whole city was into it. And then even when the team began to slump, in July, they slumped a little bit, but the team was still, they were still in contention, so the city was still behind them, and then in late August when they beat the Yankees, 3 out of 4 Yankee Stadium, they're first place at the end of August. They came back from Yankee Stadium to Union Station again. There's a huge crowd on hand, to greet them. And then the team in September, they're on the road, they're winning. Now World Series applications, are beginning to file into Griffith Stadium, people to the Senators front office, box office, because, everybody's into it now. Everyone wants to go to the World Series. So now the fans were charged up, were fired up. And then, of course, when the Senators won the World Series, the celebration in Washington was so great that they said it was even greater than the armistice in 1918. That's how much fans were into it by the end of the season.
Dan, did you have anything else before we got to the World Series, or was there something else you wanted to touch on?
Well, I guess maybe we should just mention real quick, because the end of their season is really kind of interesting. They end it with a 6-city road trip, right, Gary? And there was only 7 other teams in the league, so
that's the way it worked back then. Is the East teams would go west and the West teams would go east, and as luck would have at the end of the 1924 season, the East went west. Washington would have to play their last 20 games on the road, and like you said, 6 different cities. So yes, and the fans were following them on a daily basis through the newspapers or any way they can, But and then when Washington finally, they were in Boston. There were 2 games left in the season. They won in Boston, the second to last day of the season, and the city went wild.
Yeah, what was that? 16 or 20? Looks like they played like their last
20 games on the road. Last 20 games on the road. Yeah.
Jeez.
Yeah. That's the way
Yeah.
That's the way it worked back then.
And then they go and they play the 24 World Series against a team that had been around, been in the series for the last 3 years, the New York Giants.
Yeah, the Giants had a very good team because, well, first of all, they were very experienced because, like you said, they won 3 consecutive pennants, National League pennants, and here they were now returning for the 4th consecutive season to the World Series, and they had a very good team. They not only had a lot of depth, but they had a lot of Hall of Famers on that team. Hack Wilson, Frankie Frisch, Bill Terry, George
Freddie
Kelly,
Lindstrom, yeah.
Freddie Lindstrom. I mean, this team had they had a Hall of Fame roster, and So they were favorites. The Giants were favorites. And, most of the fans thought the Giants were going to win. Most people thought the Giants were going to win. But the feeling was, well, yes, at least, the Giants will win. But, at least Walter Johnson will pitch in the World Series, and he'll probably pitch one of the wins for Washington in the World Series. So, that at least, Johnson will win a World Series game. So that's good. Now, the thing about Walter Johnson is throughout his whole career, he had a dream. His career-long dream was to pitch a win in the World Series game. So here he was finally going to World Series, something he never thought he'd see. But here he was set to pitch the opening game of the World Series. And the thing about Walter Johnson is he was so well-liked that he was getting telegrams and letters from not only all four corners of the United States, but from all over the world. Telegrams and letters from fans telling him how happy they were for him, that he was finally going to the World Series, and that and how they were pulling for him to pitch a win in the World Series. So yes, Johnson had a dream. He wanted to win for himself, but these fans, were so nice, were so supportive of him that, he wanted to win mostly for them more than anything. He wanted to come through for the fans, and he lost the first game. In that first game of the 1924 World Series, he lost that first game. It went 12 innings. Washington lost 4-3 at Washington. Johnson pitched all 12 innings, and he threw 165 pitches. If you can imagine that.
Jeez.
I know. They have guys on pitch counts today. Back then they kept track of pitches, but they didn't have these guys on pitch counts. So he threw 165 pitches, and he lost. So, Johnson, he wasn't angry, but he was disappointed he lost because he wanted to win for the fans. But he was okay because, he knew he would have another chance to pitch in the World Series. So Game 2, Washington won. It was a walk-off win. Roger Peckenbach delivered the game-winning hit. Now the series moved to New York for the next 3 games. New York won Game 3. Game 4, Washington bounced back. Goose Goslin had a big day. They bounced back. They won Game 4. So now the series is even 2-2. And Walter Johnson was going to pitch in Game 5 at New York. Now, Johnson, he knew he had, he knew the fans were pulling for him. He wanted to win for his team, for himself, but especially for the fans. He also knew this was his last chance because he was still planning on the possibility of retiring after the season. And, this is Game 5. Game 6 was scheduled the next day. Game 7 was scheduled the day after. So he knew Game 5. He knew this was his last chance to win a game. And he felt the pressure. That morning he was with his wife before the game. That morning he was with his wife, and he kept telling her, I have to win. I absolutely have to win. I have to win today. Well, Johnson didn't win that day. He lost a tough one, another tough one to New York. And nobody was more sad. Nobody was more upset. Nobody felt worse than Walter Johnson. And after the game, he faced the sports writers, and he showed them the telegrams that he received from these baseball fans, and he read a couple. And it was really heartbreaking because one of the telegrams that he read was from a couple in Alexandria, Virginia, who named their firstborn in his honor, Walter Johnson Smith or whatever it was. They named their firstborn in his honor. And Johnson told the sports writers, he said, you know what? These telegrams make me feel even worse because, I had 2 starts in the World Series, 2 chances to come through, and I didn't come through. I lost 2 World Series games, and I'll go down as the greatest pitcher who finished his career with 2 World Series losses. So Johnson was absolutely heartbroken. When the team boarded the train, to head back to Washington for Game 6 and Game 7, it was reported that Johnson had tears in his eyes. I mean, he was just devastated that he lost. So the series goes back to Washington, for Game 6. The Giants are ahead 3-2, and they have their best pitcher going in Game 6. So everybody thinks that, the Giants are going to wrap it up in 6 games, and the Giants, the players are so confident that they're going to win Game 6 that they didn't even pack suitcases. They packed handbags. They're going to go to Washington, they're going to win, and they're going to come back to New York. Well, as it turned out, Washington got a great pitching performance from Tom Zachary, and they won 2-1. Harris knocked in both runs. They won 2-1, so there will be a Game 7. So now it's Game 7, and
I just want to point out, up until this point now, they've rotated wins every week or every game. So
Yes.
the Giants have won all the even odd numbered games. The Senators have won all the even numbered games.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So now we're heading to game 7, and Harris, he had a plan. And he told the sports writer on the West Coast, he was good friends with the sports writer, and he says, "Well, here's my plan, but I want to make sure you'll tell nobody." And when the writer guaranteed him, that this would be their secret, he would keep the secret. Harris explained to him, I'm gonna start Curly Ogden, right-handed pitcher, and then I'm gonna immediately switch to George Mogridge because Curly Ogden was a righty and Mogridge was a lefty, and Bill Terry, a left-handed hitter. The Giants had so much depth that they had like 2 lineups, one to face right-handed hitters and one to face left-handed hitters. So Harris starts righty, so the Giants would start their left-handed hitting lineup. Ogden faces one batter, and Harris takes him out of the game. Or he faces 2 batters, and Harris took him out of the game. Then brings in George Mogridge, a lefty. So now the Giants have their left-handed hitting lineup, having to face the left-hander George Mogridge. So that was the plan. And Mogridge pitched a couple innings. Washington took a 1-0 lead on a home run by Harris. So they're up 1-0. Then in the middle innings, McGraw, the manager of the Giants, he switches to his right-handed hitting lineup. So Harris brings in a right-hander, Firpo Marbury, to pitch to the Giants. So now it's a right-handed pitching facing the Giants' right-handed hitting lineup. Well, a couple Washington errors, a couple hits by the Giants. They score 3 runs in 1 inning. They take a 3-1 lead after 5 or 6 innings. So the Senators, they come to bat in the bottom of the 6th, bottom of the 7th. They go out quietly. So now it looks like the Giants are going to win the World Series. They're up 3-1 heading into the 8th inning. Well, then it's the bottom of the 8th, and the Senators get a couple of hits, including Harris gets another big hit. They rally for 2 runs. During the rally, they lifted their pitcher. Marbury was pitching. They lifted him for a pinch hitter. So Washington scored 2. Now it's tied 3-3. Game 7 is heading into the 9th inning tied. Now, all the fans, everybody knew that Harris had lifted his pitcher for a pinch hitter. So that meant there'd be a new pitcher on the mound in the top of the 9th to face the Giants. Who's pitching for Washington in the top of the 9th? Who takes the mound? Walter Johnson. Yes, another chance to win for those fans who poured in their support from all over the world. Another chance to win for Washington. Here he was, he's in the game. So in the 9th inning, what happens is he retires the first batter, but then the next batter, Frank Frisch, hits a triple. So now there's a runner on third and only 1 out, and everybody's like, "Oh my God, it's going to happen to Johnson again. He's going to lose again. Maybe it's not meant to be." Well, Johnson retires the next 2 batters, gets out of the jam. The Senators have a chance to win in the bottom of the 9th. They don't score, so now we're tied up. 9 innings. We're going into extra innings. Game 7. You can imagine how exciting this had to be. You can imagine the excitement. And, of course, everybody's just praying for Johnson to win and for Washington to score a run. Well, Johnson retires the Giants in the 10th. He retires them in the top of the 11th. Washington doesn't score, so it goes into the 12th inning, and Johnson again retires the Giants. Now it's the bottom of the 12th. The fans are on the brink of exhaustion. I mean, they're going to just drop from exhaustion. If Washington could just somehow score 1 run, well, so it's the bottom of the 12th, and Washington has the lower third of their lineup coming up. So it doesn't look like Washington will score a run. And when the first batter made an out, it looked like it would probably have to go into the 13th inning, and Johnson would have to retire the Giants again. So now Monty Rule comes to the plate, the 8th hitter in the Washington lineup, and 1 out, nobody on base. Rule only had 1 hit for the whole World Series. So he comes to the plate, he hits a foul ball, right over the plate. It's a right and back of the plate. It's a pop foul ball. All the fans groan because they think it's going to be an out. The catcher, veteran catcher for New York, Hank Gowdy, he gets under the ball. He drops his mask in front of him instead of throwing it out of the way. And the result is he steps in his mask, he stumbles, he drops the ball for an error. So Rule gets another chance. And what does he do with his other chance? He hits a grounder down the third base line, gets by the third baseman, rolls into left field. He's on second base, with a double. So now the next batter is Walter Johnson, and he gets a grounder to the shortstop, and the shortstop boots it for an error. Okay, Rule, who's on second, holds on the play. So it's now runners on first and second, only one out. The next batter is a rookie named Earl McNeely. He hits a routine ground ball to the third baseman, right to the third baseman, Freddie Lindstrom. Looks like it's going to be an inning-ending double play. The ball hits a pebble or something, whatever. It takes a high hop over the third baseman, over his head, rolls into left field. Muddy Rule, the runner on second, rounds third. He heads home. He crosses the plate. Winning run. Washington wins the World Series. And the best part about it, Walter Johnson is the winning pitcher.
And I think I heard somewhere that Muddy Rule was probably one of the slowest runners in baseball.
He was very slow, and not only that, he had caught every game for Washington since July 13th, because the Senators, they didn't have any depth, and the team lacked depth. So it was pretty much the same starters, the same pitchers, day after day. And so Muddy Rule, he was exhausted, his legs were hurting him. So not only was he slow, but he was even slower, because he was so tired. So it was interesting. The ball, on that hit, everybody thought there'd be a play at the plate, and Rule rounds third base. And, in the dugout, the Washington, they had a reserve outfielder named Nemo Leibold, and he's like pumping his fist, come on, Muddy, like he's trying to, and he's yelling, and he's pumping his fist like he's trying to pump Rule across home plate, and everybody anticipates, the left fielder for the Giants is a guy named Irish Musil, and he picks up the ball, and everybody's anticipating a play at the plate, but Musil, instead of throwing to the plate, he put the ball in his pocket, he walked off the field, and that was that.
Andrew and I have a great, what's the story, Andrew, with Irish Musial? His brother, Bob Musial, was on the Yankees, and they shared an apartment, but they didn't, one was so quiet that they wouldn't even speak. They would see each other after 2 weeks and they wouldn't even speak to each other or something like that.
I think it was Bob Musial who was the really quiet one, and Irish Musial was a little more talkative and social, but they were roommates together, but since one of them was on the road so much, they rarely saw each other. But the one time, I forget who was coming home and who was leaving, but I think Irish Musial came home from one of these, long road trips we talked about, 3 weeks, and he came in, put his bags down, and Bob got up, picked his bags up, and left for his own 3-week road trip. They didn't even really so I don't think they didn't get along. I think
they just didn't talk.
Talkative, yeah.
I didn't know that story. That's very interesting. I think I heard a story where the St. Louis Browns and the Cardinals manager in the 40s share an apartment, just like that same situation.
Mm-hmm.
One will be on the road and one will be at home, and then the vice versa. So I guess it was. I guess it could happen back then.
Yeah, and I think with that story, I actually heard that it became an issue in '44 when they played each other in the World Series. That was they finally were in St. Louis managing at the same time, and they were managing against each other.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So obviously it's a big deal when they win. And they actually almost win it again the following year, right? In 25, they go up against the Pirates, and Walter Johnson actually loses Game 7 against the Pirates in 1925.
Yeah, Johnson had another great season in 1925. He looked into retiring, didn't work out for him, so he came back, pitched, won 20 games again. Had another great season, 20 wins. They go to the World Series. He won Game 1. He beat the Pirates in Game 1. Beat him again in Game 4, I believe it was, and then in Game 7, in pouring rainstorm in Pittsburgh, he lost Game 7, unfortunately, and Washington came one win away from repeating. That was too bad, but they did win another American League pennant.
And then they win another one in 33, and then that's pretty much it. They kind of limp around for 25 years.
Yeah, I think they only had, 3 or 4 winning seasons after that, before they moved to Minnesota. They didn't have many winners. They weren't very good. So, so that was pretty much the last hurrah.
I have one more question that I want to close with, but I'll see if Andrew has anything else.
Okay.
No, I think that was pretty comprehensive, and you did a great job being thorough with the game by game of the World Series. So I think I'll let Dan ask his question now. I won't delay it any longer.
So real quick, Gary, here's the question: Nationals or Senators? Which are they?
They're actually both, and here's how it worked out. In the 1890s, Washington had a team in the National League. They were the Senators, and they were bad. I mean, they were worse than even the American League Senators. It was year after year losing season, finishing light years away from the top. They're owned by the Wagner brothers, and the Wagner brothers were known for when a player got good, they would trade him away or sell him. So the Wagner brothers were not very good owners, and Washington didn't have a good baseball team, and the fans stayed away, and that cost them their team because after the 1899 season, when the National League contracted from 12 to 8 teams, 4 teams had to go. Washington, with their poor attendance, with their poor team, they were one of the 4. So they were contracted. They were out of the National League, and then came the founding of the American League in 1901. Washington received a franchise. They had a new team. They called them the Senators. So they were the Washington Senators, and they were as bad as the National League Senators for the first 4 years. So after the 1904 season, some of the fans decided, you know what, it's got to be the name. It's bad luck. It's jinx. Senators, the Washington Senators. That means Wagner Brothers, the 1890s. We can't be associated with that. We need a new name. So they had a contest, and the Nationals was picked, and some of the semi-pro congressman teams were known as the Nationals, like in the 1870s. So they were the Nationals. They officially, in 1905, they officially became the Nationals. However, some of the fans and sports writers were against that. They were, no, this is the Senators, will always be the Senators. And some of the fans and sports writers were, no, let's go with the new name, Nationals. So because of that, the names were used interchangeably, although they were actually the Nationals, but more often referred to as the Senators. So the names were used interchangeably, and that lasted until 1957. They officially became the Senators again. They changed their name back to the Senators. So they were the Senators, and then they moved to Minnesota and became the Twins after the 1960 season. The American League expanded in 1961, added 2 more teams, including a new Washington team. They were the Senators as well. They were the Senators, and they, of course, eventually moved to become the Texas Rangers, and then the Expos Montreal. That franchise was transferred here to Washington in 2005, and they became the Nationals.
And finally won again in 2019. Well, Gary, thanks so much for joining us for this a trip 100 years back on memory lane. The book is called Team of Destiny: Walter Johnson, Clark Griffith, Bucky Harris, and the 1924 Washington Senators. Our guest has been the author, Gary Sarnoff, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me. I appreciate it.
Glad to do it. And thank you all for joining us again for this episode. We will catch you next time, but until then, I'm Dan Newman.
And I'm Andrew Newman. Goodbye, old sports.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com. Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, a.k.a. the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and were able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you got to do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You could be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you got to do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.